Last time, we talked about how your letters in Animal Crossing are internally scored, which enables villagers to read and respond to them properly. And this video quickly became my most watched video of all time, even though a lot of the information in it was already covered in 2018. Still, I suppose this video reached a more general audience, and it spawned a lot of questions, the most common of which was how does the scoring work in other languages? Also, what if I told you that there was yet another entirely different letter scoring algorithm that can be abused to guarantee a villager sends you a categorized item of your choosing? So let's quickly take one more look at Animal Crossing's rather in-depth letter system. First, a lot of you were quick to point out that the letter scoring algorithm is pretty specific to the English language. And yet, the original Animal Crossing was also released in Europe, Australia, and even China, all on top of the Japanese original. So, do each of these games score letters differently depending on their language? I couldn't really find a definitive answer to this online, so I finally got my hands dirty and did some light decompiling and data mining myself on every single GameCube version of Animal Crossing. And it turns out that, yes, the scoring algorithms do differ slightly depending on the language and region. The only exception to this is the Australian version, which works exactly the same as North America. Which of course makes sense, since Australians also speak English.
Oh, come in for a chin wag. I've got a roast chook. I'll make you a sanger.
Well, at least I thought they spoke English. More interesting is the European version, which actually has 5 copies of the game built into its disc, one for each language of English, Spanish, French, Italian, and German. The most notable change here compared to North America has to do with how the game scores valid words. If you watched my previous video, you'll know this works in English by looking at the first 3 letters of every word and cross-referencing them with an internal trigram table to see if it counts as a valid word. Obviously, the most common leading characters of a valid word differ between languages, and indeed, all of the trigram tables were updated and localized differently. For example, in English, the only valid trigram beginning with the letter Z is ZER, likely to make the word zero a valid word. However, in Spanish, for example, this table is expanded quite a bit to include trigrams like ZAP, so a word like zapatos can be interpreted as a valid word. These tables are different for every single language on the European copy. Outside of these trigram tables though, most of the other checks in English are also present in the European version and function pretty much the same. So even though languages like German have words longer than 32 characters, you'll still incur the same penalty for writing them. So really, the only check that changed is the trigram check. But it's worthy to note that writing valid trigrams is actually worth double the points in all of the European languages, scoring +6 points per valid match rather than +3. Regarding the Japanese versions, a lot of you are likely aware that the Japanese writing system typically doesn't require the use of things like punctuation or spaces, and also doesn't have an uppercase or lowercase system. This invalidates a lot of the scoring checks that are used in English. So instead, the Japanese scoring system relies solely on trigram checks, which is the same as the other languages where the starting 3 characters of each word are just cross-referenced with tables. But if Japanese doesn't require the use of spaces, then how does the game know what the start of a word is in order to begin its trigram checks? Well, even though Japanese traditionally doesn't require the use of spaces, in Animal Crossing, they expect you to include spaces in your letter. This is because the Japanese games limit you to writing in hiragana and katakana only. Even in the E+ version, where you can set your language proficiency to use kanji, you can still only write in kana. If you're at all familiar with Japanese, you'll know that if you try to use kana exclusively without separators, it makes your text quite challenging to read. And since you can only write in kana, the games expect you to use punctuation and spaces in your letter to make it legible. In this fashion, each word to be checked is expected to be in between punctuation characters or spaces, just like in English. Still, even without kanji, there are a lot of hiragana and katakana characters, over triple that of the English alphabet, meaning the trigram tables for the Japanese versions are quite extensive. Last time, I also touched on a glaring bug with the Trigram tables in the North American version, where the devs forgot to include the proper terminating stop characters at the end of each Trigram table. This results in every single Trigram lookup blowing way past its array boundaries and reading values from other tables and eventually into RAM as well. There are only supposed to be 776 valid trigrams in the game, but due to this bug, there are actually over 23,000 trigrams that the game considers valid. For example, typing some nonsense like B dog emoji key emoji is considered a proper trigram and will award you +3 points just because the values mapping to this combination of characters happens to appear in a section of RAM. And again, there are tons of combinations like this that unintentionally boost your score due to this bug. So while I was researching this, I also wrote a tool to score letters for you externally by simply typing in a box on my website. This tool should mimic every single in-game check in the North American version of the game. I even took the time to rip all 5,858 bytes of RAM that the game checks for trigrams, encoded them to their character mappings, removed the repeats, and added them to this scoring tool just to replicate the in-game bug and make it as accurate as possible. I also wanted to make this tool pretty easy to use and access, so I decided to just host it on a branch of my website, which also allows for this to be pretty mobile friendly. As with everything I publish, I've open sourced the code for this project for all to use and modify to their liking. But be warned, this is a web tool, so it's written in the evil language of pure JavaScript. Anyways, let's finally talk about how to guarantee that you receive a specific gift when sending certain letters to a villager. Those familiar with the original game might be aware that villagers will sometimes specifically request for you to write them a letter when you ask if they have any tasks for you. This actually triggers a special letter quest that remains active as long as the villager is awake and you don't reset. If you send a letter to that villager during this quest period, the letter is scored completely differently than usual, and switches to a rank-based system instead. These special quest letters can rank between 0 and 11, where your total rank is solely dependent on the following 3 checks. The first is a general length check that awards rank based on the amount of non-space characters in your letter. Next, you'll get +3 rank for free so long as your letter is 3 words or more and avoids repeating sequential characters. The code for this check is actually a bit more involved, but due to the way they set up their if statements, a lot of this doesn't really matter so long as you avoid the penalty conditions. Finally, the game simply adds +6 rank if you have a present attached to your letter. All of these checks add up for a maximum letter ranking of 11, but it is possible to score every rank below 11 if you know what you're doing. This can be beneficial since, depending on your rank, the villager will always send an item from a predetermined category as a present in the return letter. This is notably consistent every time and is summed up with this table. This means if you're talking to a villager and they happen to request for you to send them a letter, you can pre-calculate your letter's ranking and guarantee that they'll send you a present from a category of your choosing. Of course, I don't expect people to actually sit here and calculate their letters manually to get gifts in return. So I also added this system to my letter scoring tool, and you can toggle to this quest ranking with a simple checkbox. So the next time a villager asks you to send them a letter, feel free to write your letter's body in my tool first, which will tell you exactly what the villager will include as a present in return. And with that, I believe we have finally covered the most interesting things that this game's letter system has to offer. It required a bit more effort than usual to perform some of the data mining and set up the website tools, so I appreciate you all being patient while I worked on this video. And once again, thank you to Kyler and James Chambers for their original work and documentation of the letter scoring system in English. And thank you to my Patreon and YouTube members who financially support this channel and make videos and projects like this possible. Big shout out to my highest tier supporters, Lunascape, Cynthia, Dylan Trudeau, Cass, Hornet, Silly Marina, Villager, Tarumi, Vinny Diddy, Pidge01, Kai D, Japan Eat, Tammy's Head, Comfy Boy 404, Bobby Nard, Holly Molly, Exploding Bears, Idrin, Clifford Longhead, Comfy, Tenchi Prime, Goose Fart, Margery, Puff, Cray, Victor Manemu, Sarkia, Luka Turnovsky, and ya boy Ethan. And of course, thank you all for sticking around and watching. Until next time.